After two straight victories of beating opponents pretty soundly at 5v5, it looks like Winnipeg might have cracked the secret formula. Let's chat about why on tonight's episode of Locked On Winnipeg Jets.
You're Locked On the Hockey Jets, your daily podcast on the Winnipeg Jets, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hey friends, and welcome to tonight's episode of Locked On Winnipeg Jets, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. I'm your host, Harrison Lee, an avid Winnipeg Jets fan and an online blogger. You can follow me on Twitter at HLivingLoco and at LO_Winnipeg Jets. Thanks for making Locked On Jets your first listen of the day every day. If you enjoy what you're hearing, be sure to like, follow, and subscribe on all of your favorite podcasting platforms and YouTube. Doing so, of course, is always free of charge and ensures you never miss another episode. Most of all, though, we just love and appreciate your support. Tonight's episode, obviously, we have plenty to go over. The Jets will be taking on Seattle tomorrow. Winnipeg has also made its first trade, and there is a lot to unpack with all of this going on and lots of buzz around the Jets. But before we dive into some of the stuff that's upcoming and some of today's events, did want to let you know that today's episode is brought to you by Gametime. Download the Gametime app, create an account, and use code Locked On NHL for $20 off your first purchase. Now, first off, the Jets are taking on Seattle. And obviously, the Kraken they have not exactly had the kind of season that I think a lot of folks were expecting. The Kraken have kind of fallen off recently, and I don't know if it's necessarily a symptom of some deeper problems with this team. You know, in the past, when Vegas first entered the league, obviously, the Knights had the advantage of, a brand new situation where a lot of teams really weren't prepared to essentially get dunked on by Vegas, right? Now, this time, having gone through, another expansion teams were a little more prepared. So Seattle's roster wasn't quite as strong. But the other situation was that Seattle also kind of handicapped itself a little bit in my mind. I feel like they willingly made some choices and tried to do some teams some favors, expecting that it might come around and eventually pay off for them. Hasn't really happened. And Seattle finds itself towards the bottom of the Pacific Division. Not a hole that they can necessarily, it's not a hole that they can't climb out of, but I would expect that they're probably pretty firmly out of the playoff race. This is a team that I think at this point, in order to try and get back up to anywhere near the wild card, they'd have to go on a really big streak. And when you're already under 500, it's, well past the midpoint of the year. There's just not really that much benefit to trying to force what's already not looking too good for Seattle. You look at the number of teams that they would have to leapfrog, and most of it is kind of, either the mid-pack of the Central or even some of their own Pacific Division rivals, right? The Anaheim Ducks are currently ranked ahead of the Kraken if you want to get a sense of what has gone on with their season. When you look at Seattle's lineup, it's not even that they're that terrible either. You've got Schwartz, Beniers, and Kakko up front. Obviously, Kakko is a really big but relatively inexpensive acquisition to this team. He's been pretty solid. I think he's got like 7 or 8 points in his last 10 to 11 games with Seattle. Seems like, the price that they paid, which is pretty nominal in my mind, has paid off. But unfortunately, I think one of their biggest problems is on the second line. So you've got Burakovsky, Stevenson, and Bjorkstrand, and this line, not so great. The problem kind of sits down the middle. Chandler Stevenson is being paid like $7 million for multiple seasons to be a second-line center, and he was never really that guy. I think in a lot of ways the Kraken didn't really understand what made Vegas' version of Chandler Stevenson successful, and it kind of starts with Mark Stone and other players like that. It's not that Chandler is a bad player, but, he was clearly well past his prime when they signed him, and I think that there were all sorts of red flags on this contract. And so, kind of like the Jets in some ways, you've got an even bigger hole here for the 2C role. The third line is where, some intrigue starts to show up. You've got McCann, Wright, and Tolvanen. And now I'm actually pretty interested in McCann myself. I'd like to see what he looks like because I think Seattle might actually be a really legit trade partner for the Jets. But We'll chat about some stuff that could come out of this later. But the fourth line, Hayden, Stevens, and our old friend Tanev, good to see him again. Hopefully the Jets are not going to try and trade for him. I saw somebody on Twitter joke that they would definitely take a pass at him. I would hope that that sort of reunion kind of stays in the theoretical stage. On defense, you've got Dunn and Larson as your first, Evans and Montour as your second, and Alexiak and Mahura as your third. In terms of potential trade targets here, not really anyone I would be too enthused by. I could see the Jets trying to go for like an Alexiak or something, but at this stage of his career, probably somebody that I would be less interested in going after. But for the Jets, this could be a bit of an audition for, I don't know, maybe you'd be interested in a Burakovsky or a McCann. Personally, I would be less enthused about Burakovsky. I don't think that he's really somebody to trade for at this stage of his career. You'll notice that there's a pretty conspicuous absence of somebody that we're going to talk about later this episode, a guy who might actually fit the Jets pretty well, and that's Yanni Gourde. But, otherwise, this is about as healthy as they're going to be. McCann, with his contract price being pretty low, he's, basically $5 million for the next couple of years. I wonder if he might actually be attainable. McCann has been a really good player for much of his career. He is pretty bargain priced, and I kind of wonder if the Jets might be able to take a pass, especially a guy who has, the past couple of years been a 50 to 70 point player. You put him in the right role and you get him on this team, and I think he could absolutely cook. But I don't really anticipate that Seattle wants to move him. And my guess is, given his low cap hit and, the term that he's got, probably not going to be within the realm of attainability for the Jets right now until we start getting closer to the TDL. This year's market's going to be very interesting. But in terms of Winnipeg's own lineup, they're not really looking to make too many changes. I think that they are probably going to do the same thing that they did in the previous game against Colorado and whatnot. So obviously, this past Tuesday, big win as well. And I think the Jets probably just want to keep things going. I think Winnipeg was impressed with how they played against, both Colorado and Vancouver. I think that that's been good to see the middle six really stepping up. I think the line combinations in the absence of Nemesnikov and Appleton have really paid off. I hope that the coaching staff is kind of identifying that, some of these pairings and duos matter a little more than others. Getting Ehlers away from Perfetti, big change. Connor and Scheifele obviously have been better this year by a fair bit. I think it's really down to Kyle Connor himself being just really a top-line talent. And when his contract extension comes around, don't be shocked when we're starting to talk about $11 to $12 million a year, which, given how good he's been this season, if he plays like this for the next couple of seasons, I would never really have questions about an extension. In fact, he's played so well that I kind of wish this was the version that we had gotten for the past several years. But now that he actually backchecks, he's kind of pretty darn sick. That defensive work actually bleeds into creating more offense because he's spending less time in his own end. So that is great to see. But I think for this game, right, Seattle was probably desperate to try and get something going. They did have a road win against Pittsburgh. It was a big, very come-from-behind comeback win. But, at this point, Seattle, they're looking to sell. This is kind of an audition game, and maybe Seattle likes something that the Jets have in their prospect ranks or something. Because I think at this point, the Kraken are probably thinking about the future. And if you could get a Gourde or a McCann out of this, maybe, just maybe, that's going to give you some real solid scoring depth and some really good talent with potentially a little bit of contract control when it comes to McCann. But we'll probably talk a little bit more about some trade scenarios in the future, especially with respect to the Kraken and maybe some other teams. But of course, the Jets actually did make a trade earlier today. This one, Isaak Phillips for Dmitry Kuzmin. Let's chat about that in just a brief moment. Before we go any further, though, did want to let you know about our friends and partners at Gametime. I love going to games and sometimes concerts as well. I've been to all sorts of stuff, even a couple of comedy performances. There's just nothing like being there in person, right? You go to a Ravens game and the roar of the crowd's amazing. It's been several years since I was last in Winnipeg, but, going to Jets games was awesome. and you just feel like the vibe and energy is unmatched. And Gametime knows exactly what that feels like. That's why they want to help you get to games with even better pricing and seats. They offer a brand new feature called Gametime Picks that filters out all the fluff to show you only amazing deals on fantastic seats. It saves you a lot of time from wading through all of the crap and going through tickets that don't really fit what you're looking for. And what's really great about this is that they actually show you seat views. So you're not only getting the best deal that you can, but you're also seeing exactly what you're going to be getting once you get to the venue, whether you're sitting, outdoors or indoors, whatever it is. They've got seat views. And when you toggle all in pricing, you'll see exactly what you're paying for up front. It helped me last year when I went to go see Baltimore versus Kansas City in the championship game. Was a great time, and I knew exactly what I was dealing with up front. It took all the guesswork out, and if you want to do that too, be sure to download the Gametime app, create an account, and be sure to use code LOCKEDONNHL for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Again, create an account and use code LOCKEDONNHL for $20 off. Download Gametime today. What time is it? Game time. Hey friends, and welcome back to this episode of Locked On Winnipeg Jets, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Everydayers, thank you so much for rejoining us on tonight's episode, as obviously we were just chatting a little bit about potentially some trade auditions for the Jets here in tomorrow's game against the Seattle Kraken. The one player that I'd probably say the Jets are most likely interested in is not going to be playing, unfortunately, but, it is what it is. All that said, the Jets actually made a trade today, which was interesting. Didn't really expect them to do that. But if you've been following the Moose season, you probably know it's not been going super well. Manitoba has just been not great. Turn of the year, it's been a lot better, but I wouldn't say that, Manitoba has really impressed. And when you look at a lot of the scoring records for this team recently, it's definitely bleeding into, the skater stats. Brad Lambert's point totals don't look crazy. Nikita Chibrikov doesn't really look like he's having a nut season when you look at just the raw point totals. And so, for the Jets, it's probably been a little bit of a sore spot, and they're trying to figure out some way to get this team going. I know that the AHL is often seen as a development league. In my mind, it's not really the case with this whole second tier. It's a good place to send prospects if you want them to learn some aspects of North American pro hockey and really just being a pro at this level, but it's less developmental in a lot of ways for young talent. And I think that the Moose have been an especially egregious example this year of just a really bad team that desperately needs offense and some sort of stability. Defensively, they've generally been decent, pretty decent, but they've brought in here Isaak Phillips from the Rockford IceHogs / Chicago Blackhawks in exchange for Dmitry Kuzmin. Kuzmin, for whatever I thought he was going to be at this level, hasn't really materialized into a particularly noteworthy puck-moving blue liner. He is still young, but I think at this point, you're not really too stressed out about it. Phillips is... well, he's actually played NHL games. He's had a cup of coffee. He's played like 40 or 50 odd games, and he's not terrible. I think he's more Logan Stanley than, maybe, a Dylan Coughlin or something. But in terms of a guy who's, an early 20s, big left-handed defender who can actually be, halfway reasonable if you call him up, I don't really hate it. I mean, it's probably to help the Moose more than anything, but I think he's on a two-way deal this year. And, given the situation with Winnipeg's defense being, well, in this case, frequently injured this year, I don't hate it. I don't mind if the Jets maybe want to see if he can be not only a stabilizing force for Manitoba, but perhaps a guy who could essentially be a free potential audition sort of guy for the Jets. I don't really think that I would need to see him at the NHL level consistently, but, if he happens to be decent, maybe he really lights it up with Manitoba. Maybe he really proves that he actually does deserve an NHL role. And, again, the prize was Dmitry Kuzmin. Why not find out if he can actually be a little more than just an AHLer? Chicago has not exactly been the best development spot for a lot of youth talent. Maybe Phillips can do something that starts to look more and more like, a higher level professional than what he's had with the Hawks organization. So considering that, It's not really a big deal. It's a depth deal, but it does give me some intrigue as to how the Jets maybe view their third pairing. Kind of seems like Heinola is probably here to stick around for the foreseeable future. I don't know what that means for Stanley. Logan, I think organizationally, I think the coaching staff likes him more than the front office does. And so I think that there's going to be some level of tension here until, not necessarily a disagreement, but maybe, the Jets trying to figure out what to do with him. I know that some of the Jets media is pretty convinced that Stanley's going to be here, through the whole season. But I'm starting to wonder if that's really the case. Every game that I watch Logan, he just seems like he's lost. In the games where it's slower and he has less to do, he's not as noticeable. But in these games more recently, where you saw the game against Vancouver, their only goal came off of a really bad mishandle, and it was because he was too slow to react to the puck not only coming to him, trying to settle it down, but also then pivoting, and he just got dispossessed in like one quick move, and Höglander just absolutely roofed one over Hellebuck's shoulder. This is not the first time that this has happened. Stanley, unfortunately, has cost the Jets now 2 shutouts this season, and actually, those are 2 shutouts that Hellebuck could have had. It would have been a career high shutout if he'd gotten his 7th on the season. So, I mean, it's just, look, in the grand scheme of things, it's small stuff, but I think when you look at how Winnipeg has tried to, make Logan Stanley work and all of this stuff, I just don't really get it, right? If this was, a player that was actually treated like a 7th or 8th defender, it wouldn't be a big deal. But Winnipeg has often given him preference over a lot of other guys. And so Phillips coming in is kind of interesting because I think he could actually be the Logan Stanley replacement, but he's younger. He's got a little more upside. And generally speaking, I think he's actually had better on ice results. Not that this is saying like tons here, like, don't get me wrong. I'm not exactly looking at Phillips as, an elite third pairing guy, but he does have a little more upside. And, at least at the AHL level, he's actually been pretty good. He's been putting up like 25-ish points a season for Rockford for the most part. And maybe he can help out with the Moose offense as well. Maybe a strong, big-bodied, smooth-skating, left-handed defender with, a decent shot might be a bit of a boost. But, for the Jets, maybe it also signals that they are at some point preparing to move on from Stanley. But I still don't think that's the case, at least with respect to the coaching staff. I think the Jets coaches like Stanley, even if, the rest of us are kind of watching and wondering what they're seeing, because, like, I personally do not. But hey, you never know. I don't know. I've tried to figure out what Winnipeg is thinking here, and so far I've not really come away with a particularly I guess good conclusion. But in terms of this trade, I hope that maybe organizationally speaking, Phillips does enough to at some point supplant Stanley as like your big shutdown left-sided D, who is more of the 7th, right? I think that's really the cap on Isaac's potential. But hey, if that's what he is, all it cost you was Kuzman, who'd never looked like he was going to be an NHLer to begin with. So not too bad. May not be the only time the Jets trade with Chicago this year. The Blackhawks are probably going to be doing more selling again at some point. I've seen some people, whether in Discord, the Discords that I'm in, or even on social media, talking about, the Jets maybe being interested in like Taylor Hall or something. I would personally hope the Jets set their targets a little bit higher. I think it's fine to bring in a depth defender from Chicago. Wouldn't really be looking at anyone else. Maybe Teravainen somehow wants to leave, but aside from that, if you look at this team, there's just not really a lot that would fit Winnipeg's needs. And I don't think I really want like a 34-year-old who's probably scoring more in the marginal middle 6 range than you'd personally care for, or any of the other defenders on this team, man. The Chicago offense and defense, not particularly great, and it's not the kind of team where you're really projecting them to be significantly better if one of these guys left the team, right? So for Winnipeg, I think this might be the only deal I'd really be after. So let's look at other trade partners instead. But, kind of on that vein, I did mention earlier that maybe one of the more underappreciated but also very interesting trade targets for the Jets, is still injured right now, but he could be available. And, for the Jets, Yanni Gourde might be the kind of player that they're looking for to plug into their center spot, right? They're looking for somebody who can be a versatile middle six center, probably slide in above Lowry. And, Yanni Gourde might just be that guy who's got enough skill to kind of keep pace with an Ehlers and get this team's offense, especially with the top nine, almost in an unmatched position, right? If you've got Scheifele, Gourde, and Lowry as your three centers, obviously, you're not going to have a McDavid or a McKinnon, but you've got a pretty dang good matchup. That three-headed monster is pretty darn unbeatable by most teams around the league. Even, Colorado only has like McKinnon as really their top end center. Middlestats good, but I think you could definitely beat them out with, Lowry and Gourde manning your top nine. So we'll chat about Gordon a little bit and what he might provide the Jets if Winnipeg might be interested in him. But before we go too much further, did want to let you know about our friends and partners at Indeed. You just realized your business needed to hire somebody yesterday. How can you find amazing candidates fast? Well, surprisingly, it's pretty dang easy. Just use Indeed. When it comes to hiring, Indeed is all you need. Stop struggling to get your job post seen on other sites. Indeed's sponsored jobs put your post at the top of the page and help you reach the right candidates faster. When I was looking for work a while back, Indeed was actually super convenient. It gave me a great resume building software. The platform is very easy, very straightforward, and I could complete my profile in, maybe less than a day, just a couple of hours, really. I completed it. I put in my salary requirements and interest, my job history, and it actually immediately matched me to tons of great job openings that not only fit my salary requirements, but also my work experience and domains of expertise, which is fantastic, right? As somebody looking for work, it couldn't be easier. And if you're a business owner or an employer, you're just thinking to yourself, wow, that sounds super convenient. And it really is. Indeed is fast, it's efficient, and it'll bring you some of the top candidates in the pool immediately. You can speed up your hiring process with a $75 sponsored job credit. Just go to Indeed.com/lockedon right now and support our show by saying you heard about us or you heard about Indeed on this podcast. Terms and conditions apply. Hiring, Indeed is all you need. Hey, friends, and welcome back to this episode of Locked On Winnipeg Jets, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Every day, thank you so much for rejoining us in tonight's episode as we were just chatting a little bit about some potential trade stuff. I mentioned earlier that Winnipeg might be after a really big player, or perhaps they might go for the more budget option. And, in my case, I kind of want them to swing big, but I know that the Jets traditionally haven't. And one guy who could be available and might be a really interesting fit for Winnipeg is Yanni Gourde. His cap hit is pretty modest, and it'll be modest by the trade deadline. Gourde is currently injured, so no worries about that. They probably won't go for him for, at least a handful more of weeks here just to get the cap hit down and accrue more space. But Gourde could fit on this team and become instantly one of Winnipeg's better centers. His career is very interesting. He's been with Tampa Bay and he's been with Seattle, and throughout most of his time, he's kind of been more in the Lowry tier of center in terms of deployments, but he's really put up some pretty hefty numbers. His best season was actually, the Jets Cup year run. He had like 64 points when he was playing 16 or 17 minutes. Since then, I think you're traditionally getting somewhere between 40 and 50-ish points, not really hitting 50 quite as much, but 30, 35, 36 points in your worst seasons, I think is pretty darn good for a guy who's not really playing a huge amount of minutes. But I think for the Jets, Gourde brings enough finishing talent, enough passing ability, forechecking, skating, speed, and skill to be a pesky little dude. He's not like a really overly physical player in terms of size and stature, but he'll grind on the forecheck, grind along the walls, and he's kind of like this versatile do-it-all sort of player, right? I actually would say if Chibrikov kind of becomes a future Gourde, that's probably a best-case scenario for Nikita. Gourde is really industrious. He's always working to create offense down low, and I think in a lot of ways he'd be an ideal fit for how the Jets kind of see their top nine. You could basically use him on your second or your third line, and I think he would absolutely do bits. And if you put him with Ehlers, man, I could be, pretty thrilled with that. He's also a player that you might actually want to extend at some point. Gord may not cost you an arm and a leg if you want to offer him some term after the season, maybe like 4 years or something. Obviously, he is kind of on the wrong side of 30, so I'm probably looking more at a rental in this case. But Gord has traditionally been really good at putting up pretty decent numbers. He won't, be afraid to grind in the corners and occasionally throw a nasty hit or two. He's just a really good physical, all-around sort of attacker. And I think the kind of player that, won't cost you an arm and a leg. The Jets could probably plug and play him almost immediately, and I think they'll see a massive improvement in the skill. He kind of does, I think, a lot of the stuff that the Jets think Nemesnikov does, but he actually does it better, and he does it at the level of like a middle to like a middle six to maybe second line sort of center. So in that way, I'd be very down with it. I also wonder if the Jets could try and package him and maybe like Jared McCann. If you get McCann in this team too, you basically have an almost unbeatable top nine. You will have to move out some roster players and probably clear out some salary and maybe some prospects to make it all happen. But, for the Jets, if you're really swinging big, a twosome of Gord and McCann coming to Winnipeg could be tremendously impactful. I'm personally a big fan of that kind of approach, doing a package deal. I think you could come away with like a completely overhauled top nine going for both of them. And, with Gord, I don't think he would cost you crazy amounts. McCann will be not cheap. I would actually expect him to be pretty expensive. But again, given his age and his term and the cap hit and his production relative to that, you kind of got to go with it. I actually really like McCann's term, especially for the window that the Jets have. He's a top six winger with some ability to actually play down the middle. And I think for the Jets, he would be a fantastic upgrade, instantly a huge boost to this offense. He can play on the power play as well, and he could be an absolutely like lethal finisher. So, I think that there's some interesting opportunities here. It's not that long ago that McCann scored 40 goals. Last year was a 29-goal season. Previous year was 27 goals. Maybe you can make it happen. I don't know. We'll have to see. Seattle probably likes him a lot. They probably won't feel that he is somebody that they want to get away from necessarily. But my mind, I think McCann's 28. He's probably not, getting any better as time goes on. And so if you can cash in on him, Seattle might be well to do that, especially making a couple of changes. And I wonder if, Appleton goes back. Maybe, this is the kind of deal where you start talking about moving a Lambert or something. I think that there's like legitimate opportunities for the Jets and Kraken to come away with a big deal here. But curious to know what your thoughts are. Drop your assessment of those potential trade options below or at my social medias at HLivingLoco and at LO_Winnipeg Jets. I think for tonight's episode, though, that is going to be all the time that we have. Tomorrow, we will try and have some coverage from Winnipeg versus Seattle. Hopefully, it's going to be a late game, so we'll have to see if we can get in on time. But we'll have to just kind of play it by ear. But otherwise, we will have some other coverage and probably talking a little bit more about the trade deadline for the Jets and what their needs might be as they continue to evolve and the Jets continue to find new line combinations that are working for them. But like I said, for tonight's episode, that is going to be all the time that we have. Thank you so much for making Locked On Jets your first listen of the day, every day. We'll see you back here tomorrow. So see you then. Have a great night. And as always, go Jets go.